So to say that that reporting that we did created major repercussions in Brazil is to understate the case. And last night I gave you an update at the very end of the show for a few minutes about exactly what those repercussions were. But having just participated in a debate with a fellow journalist, a Brazilian journalist who for a long time worked for Folha, the largest newspaper, and it was hosted by another journalist who also works for Folha, who herself has been targeted by the Bolsonaro movement with all kinds of attacks personally over the internet. So both of them were essentially fully in agreement with the censorship regime. And as the New York Times itself said, basically the entire corporate media in Brazil is united with the Brazilian left. It's ironic because the Brazilian left, like the American left, likes to think of itself as the enemy of the corporate media, but in reality, as so often happens in the United States as well, the Brazilian left is united now with the corporate media, including Globo, the biggest media corporation in the country that they always used to accuse of being anti-democratic and fascist, because they are and they were. But now suddenly the left and the corporate media find themselves on the same side ever since the emergence of Bolsonaro and his movement, just like the American left finds itself on the same side of the CIA, the FBI, and the entire corporate media, the NBC News in the United States. So the dynamic is the same. You almost can't find a member of the corporate media in Brazil willing to question, let alone criticize, this censorship regime. So I was reflecting on several parts of this debate I just had. And honestly, the thing that amazed me the most, well, two things. These are the 2 points I wanted to make, because I think when you can understand how the human brain functions, how the human psyche can be exploited by authorities, it can help in many ways see the threats emerging in your own country and think about how to fight against them, but also understand why they're successful. So to start off with, and this sounds like a technical point, and on some level it is, it's not as exciting as these broader themes of free speech and due process. The law that was implemented that allows this judge to issue these orders, essentially ordering anybody and anything that he wants off of the internet with no appeal, no transparency, no due process, was a law that was very newly implemented that was based on the argument that the integrity of the election happening in Brazil in October 22 required protection from disinformation. And so it empowered this judge, acting alone, to decide what is true and what is false, and therefore to ban from the internet anything he decided was false or was disinformation. That is, or what constituted anti-democratic actions, meaning incitement to violence or attempts to overthrow the democratic framework in Brazil, all in his unilateral judgment, no trial or anything else. But the understanding of this law and the way they defended it, even for people who were questioning it and found it worrying, was, oh, don't worry. This law is just temporary. It's just for the election. And as soon as the election is over, said one of the key members of the Supreme Court, Carmen Lucia, she said, as soon as the election is over, the very next day, this law will cease to exist, which was October 31st. And yet here Alessandro de Moraes is continuing to use this power that was supposed to be dependent on the existence of the election, even though the election was over almost 3 months ago. Very similar to how the Patriot Act, we were told, would be temporary just as soon as we got this terrorism problem under control. Nobody worries about Al-Qaeda any longer, or ISIS. And yet the Patriot Act is not only in full force 22 years later, but nobody even thinks about, with a few exceptions, trying to reform it, let alone repeal it. And so the fact that no one on the left or in the media seems to care that this judge is using powers that have no legal basis reveals to me something extremely disturbing, which is when you give a political group an intoxicating power, such as the ability to censor your enemies and punish your political adversaries, imagine what a feeling of power that gives you. You know, it was like what we saw with Elon Musk when he bought Twitter and was suddenly the sole owner. Imagine if you were using Twitter and had the opportunity or the ability at any moment to just click delete or block or ban. That's hard. That's a hard power to resist, and he didn't resist it on several occasions. I think he's made strides in avoiding that, but you saw that dynamic at play. But it's an incredibly intoxicating power, and so when you convince a group of people that their political adversaries are no longer just political opponents, but are this grave and existential threat to everything decent, to democracy, to freedom, that you're fighting the new Hitler, as many in the United States got American citizens to believe, and as absolutely much of the Brazilian left and even parts of the center left believe, that we're fighting not a political movement that's a right-wing movement with which we disagree, but a fascist Nazi movement that wants to overthrow Brazilian democracy, even though they participated in the elections and did very well in them. Once you convince yourself of that, you stop caring about things like ethical limits or legal limits or constitutional guarantees. The attitude emerges almost explicitly that the threat that we face is so grave that we can't afford the luxury of caring about those kind of trivialities, like limits on the legal power of authorities or constitutional guarantees. Those are boring technicalities that maybe in normal times we can care about, but right now we're not in normal times and therefore we can't. That is, however dangerous you think the Bolsonaro movement is, or the furthest right-wing sector of it is, that mentality is at least as dangerous, and I would argue more so, wherever it emerges. That's what history demonstrates. The other point I wanted to make is, one of the lessons I think most of us learned in the United States after the September 11th attack was that sometimes threats can be very real, but the dangers of allowing the government to claim unlimited power in the name of fighting those threats can be even more dangerous. I mean, I was somebody who lived and worked in New York for 10 years when 9/11 happened. I lived in Manhattan. I was in my office in Manhattan when it happened. I remember walking around for weeks seeing those horrible signs of desperate families continuing to try and believe that people who were obviously dead under the rubble were somehow with amnesia in hospitals. It was an incredibly traumatizing moment. And talk about a real threat. This wasn't a case like January 6th in the US or January 8th in Brazil, where people invaded government buildings by breaking windows with chairs and destroying art and furniture. They flew a commercial jet filled with people and fuel for an intercontinental flight into the Pentagon, the center of American military power. That, whatever you think of it, that was a real attack. And yet I think one of the lessons that people have learned, including people who supported the war on terror, which was roughly 70% of the American public, and I've heard Fox hosts say this, I've heard conservative politicians say it, is the lesson we learned is we have to guard against overreaction. We can't just give in to whatever powers the government demands, even if they're claiming that they need these powers to protect us against what in fact is an actual threat, as 9/11 was. But it's amazing to watch another country, Brazil, repeat that exact dynamic to the point where the few people who are willing to stand up and question what this judge is doing get accused of being pro-terrorist or on the side of the terrorists, just like anyone questioning Bush and Cheney or the Patriot Act or the war in Afghanistan, such as Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who, whatever else you think of her, deserves immense credit as the one person willing to vote against authorizing military force in Afghanistan on the ground that doing so would lead to an endless war and wouldn't end up changing anything in Afghanistan. Whatever you think of her in that argument, she certainly was proven prescient and vindicated after 20 years when we left and the Taliban returned to power. Everyone who stood up and questioned the government in that climate was deemed a terrorist or a terrorist lover, a sympathizer of terrorism. And it's an incredibly powerful demonizing tactic to prevent dissent, because as human beings, we are still tribal. 5,000 years ago, being expelled from our tribe meant death. And even though we can survive much more on our own now, we still need and crave, even the most independent among us, some kind of approval or connection to the broader society. And so the ability to brand somebody as a terrorist supporter for not immediately accepting every power claimed by the government is a very potent one. And we're seeing in Brazil right now in the face of a threat that I would argue was clearly less grave than what happened on September 11th, no matter how grave you think it is, we're seeing history repeat itself because the human psyche just doesn't change. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.